good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're connecting from. In Singapore here, we are afternoon. I think our guest speaker in Israel is now in the morning. So depending on where you're connecting from. Okay, my name is William. I am from the Cloud Security Alliance Singapore chapter, as you can see on the screen. This is a seminar, webinar that we arrange as part of the series to educate the public and also to share Cloud Security Alliance Singapore chapter, the events that what we have planned for. Okay, so let me just quickly go through. Allow me maybe a few minutes to introduce Singapore chapter, Cloud Security Alliance Singapore chapter. Who we are. Okay, we are a group of our passionate professional. We are a group of our professional like to involve in cybersecurity and cloud platform. And what we do is to provide a representation of cloud security professional to the government, country, and also industry. And as part of our education, public community, all these things, we do conduct a lot of webinars. I like to call seminar because we are not CB, so we still webinars. So there's a lot of events that we plan for. Later, I will share with you some of these events, that coming events. I will suggest that, if possible, you go to our website, which in this slide here. First of all, I like to highlight the point that we are open for application, membership application. We would like to invite you as a professional, or if you are corporate, as a corporate membership. If you are students, you also can join CSA Singapore chapter as a student member. Or if you are just a startup, of course, we also encourage you to join this Cloud Security Alliance Singapore chapter. For more information, you can visit our website, https://cloudsecurityalliance.org/Singapore/. You can go to our website and look for some of this information, or if you prefer, you can send an email to the what is on the screen now, csa.sgchapter@gmail.com. Any information that you need about membership or any query or any other additional thing that you'd like to know more about Cloud Security Alliance Singapore chapter, we will respond back to you accordingly. Okay. So I think the benefits is a lot more than listed here. This is not the whole list. There are a bit of things that just to share due to the time limit. Of course, things like if you're interested in project, research, or community about cloud security, about cloud platform, or this thing, I will urge you to join us to have a voice together so that we can project ourselves to the industry and also to work together with the government to set certain standards or set certain things to help the community. Okay, this is some of the events that organize, past event as also the coming events that organized by Cloud Security Alliance. Notice that it's mostly from Cloud Security Asia Pac, but at the same time, our Singapore chapter, we are organizing more events to reach out the community and also to educate about cloud security and cloud computing platform to the public. So look out for more events coming in our website, and also we need your support to register for the event so that we can work together for the benefits of cloud security in Singapore here. With that, let me do a very short introduction about our guest speaker. Without further ado, our guest speaker is from Israel. His name is Mr. Nati, and he has many years in cybersecurity as a professional, a practitioner for offensive and defensive. Okay. With that, I will pass over the stage to Mr. Nati. Mr. Nati.
Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you, the Singapore chapter of the Cloud Security Alliance. I hope you enjoyed the session. I think the purpose of the session today is mostly to give you a sense of what we're experiencing with Polyrize about the cloud security threats, trends, and some practical steps about how to mitigate it. By the end of the presentation, there are going to be a short question sessions, and then we're going to have also a panel discussion. I hope you enjoy it. So just a few words about myself. So today I'm the CEO and co-founder of Polyrize. Prior to that, I was the CTO of an IoT security company called SAM Seamless Network, software-only solution for home gateways to secure them and the IoT devices. Okay, perfect. Yeah. So I was just saying, and before SAM Seamless Network, I served for 7 years in the Intelligence Force and the Ministry of Defense for several roles for the cybersecurity research, development, project management. As I mentioned, today I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Polyrize. Just in a nutshell, we're a pioneer in the field of securing identities and their privileges across the cloud, helping security team easily understand and protect their cloud identity and access across SaaS, IaaS, and IDaaS, which is something that's considered to be pretty innovative. So we'll start with a short brief about the challenges and the opportunities that we see today with the usage, the evolving usage of cloud services. So obviously, we all understand that cloud is a great enabler for business. It's easy to deploy, and from the IT and the security teams, the advantage is clear. You don't need to do this 24/7 maintenance. You don't have any downtime for software upgrades, etc. So this is the bright side, but there are also a few drawbacks. And I think that it's mostly these drawbacks talks about the fact that it's growing really fast. And I think that, for decades, we saw IT providers creating software that is designated for the on-premise world. And I think that because the cloud is growing so fast, the market is just kind of struggling to catch up. And not just the market, by the way, but also security and IT teams. I think that for them, every service is just an entire new domain for them. They need to learn the access model. They need to understand what are the pitfalls with this service, how to detect misconfiguration there. And there's one crucial fact that is important to remember about the cloud, that any mistake can be very harmful, because obviously this is a public infrastructure. We don't have all the different defense lines that we all know from the on-premise world. And when it's new for the users, it's new for the IT guys, so probably mistakes are going to happen. So with this introduction, security teams kind of need to get used to the shared responsibility model, because right now they have less responsibility on them. But on the other hand, as I said, it requires different tools. It requires different methods. So we see this with SaaS and from IaaS to SaaS. So no more about securing the infrastructure itself, but more about the application level, identity, data. And because it's new, we see that the market, the cyber threat landscape is evolving. Attackers understand more and more the opportunities. Users tend to make more mistakes, both from the user perspective, but also from the IT security team. So if we go pretty fast on the statistics that we saw here. So on the bottom, you can find a few of the statistics that we found with Polyrize. So for example, one new evolving challenge that we see is the external entities. So when you compare it to the past, external vendors used to have their accounts part of your organization, so you were creating for them new users, let's say with the Active Directory. Today they're accessing directly with their own corporate account, which means that you cannot do any governance about password complexity, implementing MFA, doing an appropriate offboarding. So today we see 90% of cloud identities of external contractors. No one is revoking their permissions, so they're just piling them up. In addition to that, when we talk about cloud identities, we rarely see organizations actively revoking permissions from their identity, which is a very problematic situation, as well as revoking, just disabling identities that are not being used. I think it's starting from the challenge of even mapping them, because in addition to the single sign-on solutions that we see, the single sign-on users, there's a lot of local IAM users that tend to be left behind. Two things that are more about Singapore. So we see that it becoming more and more common cloud security attacks. And we see that, and we're also expecting to see more of these attacks, not because the cloud is less secure, again, because it's still new, and because a lot of organizations are shifting to the public cloud, so obviously the attack surface is expanding there. By the way, in the States, you can see that it's already there. We see that CrowdStrike stated that last year, 2019, was the first year that malware-free attacks were more common than malware-based attacks. Just to make it clear, malware-free attacks means that there was an access abuse, credential theft, phishing. So all these type of attacks are becoming more and more common, even more than the malware-based attack. So this traditional threat landscape of payload-based attacks is starting to change. From our point of view, we see that actually happening. We see a lot of attempts to do credential theft. We see external vendors that their identities either being took over or just insider threats. This is a lot of we see many cases of this. And also in terms of human errors, so as I mentioned, it's out there, it's in the public cloud. So one of the problems is that every misconfiguration can just expose one aspect of your infrastructure or application with a click of a button, which makes you, which requires the organization to be much more sharp about the way they're giving permissions and changing configurations of these different services. So with this intro about the threat landscape, I would like to show you two interesting and unique scenarios that we identify with our cybersecurity research team in Polyrize. And the reason why I like to demonstrate them is because this type of threats will not exist in the on-premise world. So I'll try to make it clear as I can and walk you step by step. And obviously, if you have any further question, you can ask it on the question session or just send me email to the address that appear on my background. So the first part is about an account takeover. When I say account takeover, I mean the entire AWS account, not just of one user, by misconfiguring permissions of a role on AWS. So one of the things that we see with AWS is that you have two aspects of permissions. One is the accessible resources and actions that the user can do with this role. And second is the ability of this role to do self-assignment to other permissions. So what we saw with this company is that they used to have a public EC2 instance, which is good. They intended to have this public EC2 instance. And they also did allegedly good work with right-sizing the permissions of this of the role that's running on this instance to be able to access just a very narrow amount of resources inside their organization. Now, the problem is that, let's say that this instance is running an unpatched version of web service, or someone managed to get through GitHub an access token that let them get a shell on this machine. So allegedly, the risk is hedged because there's only a weak role with this session. So as soon as the user will go into this machine, he will try to get a specific role to see what are the sessions that are running on this machine, and he will find this weak role. Now, the unique thing about IAM roles with AWS is that they allow the user actually to do self-assignment of other roles. So let's say now we're having this weak role, the attacker got this weak role. Now he's able to see he's able to assume to do self-assignment of other roles. So he can try all the default roles that he knows from AWS. And one of them is the built-in admin role, which in that case with this company, they had it with this allegedly weak role. So as soon as user is able to do the self-assignment of a built-in admin role, it means that this user can actually took over the entire AWS account of the organization, which is kind of emphasize the fact how different and unique the state of mind of security and cloud security, things that we don't know or are less familiar from, the Active Directory world and the way we used to manage admins back then. So just to sum it up, as a practical actionable steps, when you're running a public machine with AWS, it's very important to see that the scope of the permission is very limited. And when you're talking about limiting permissions of a role, there are two aspects. First is the accessible resources and actions of this identity. Second is this potential role assignment and making sure that the privileges are not able to grow by doing any type of escalation attempt. The second scenario is about Salesforce. So we saw it with IaaS, and now I think it's important to see how it looks like on software as a service. So what I'm going to show you right now is how we can leverage the weak permissions of a user with Salesforce just by having permission called Apex Author to become the admin of Salesforce. Just to give a general background and make sure we're all aligned, Salesforce Apex, it's a proprietary language that Salesforce created in order to customize the experience of using their CRM for different industries and customers. So basically, let's say we have a managed services or a support or a support user. So there's a lot of users who has the access to be an author of the Apex permission. So let's say we have this type of user. He doesn't have any access to the Salesforce object themselves. He doesn't have any admin rights. Now, what we discovered with our research team is that if you're going to write, this user going to write a simple Apex script that's saying that if action X is happening, and action X is kind of installing a trigger. You can set a trigger, and as soon as this trigger is happening, you can create a corresponding event. So what Bob wrote is that if action X is being triggered by any user, no matter who, please activate a short program called trigger A. And what trigger A is doing is actually assigning Bob as an admin. Again, doing some kind of a self-assignment. So what left for Bob, which is a smart support user, is to commit action X, and then after it's going to happen, it's going to become an admin. And then, I mean, this is just demonstrate the fact how important it is to understand privileges and to understand the potential risk by assigning permissions of identities across the cloud. And we like to call it like, this is how privilege escalation look like in 2020. So this is just two scenarios that we saw, Salesforce and AWS, both of them are prominent services today that everybody is using, just to emphasize the fact that the threat landscape is changing. The next thing I would like to talk about is the importance of proactive, predictive, and reactive cloud security. So obviously, we're not going to do a 100% coverage for this domain, but we're going to try to kind of cover most of the important things there. So we're going to talk about identity, privileges, resources, and of course posture and compliance. So when we start with identity, talking about identity, so being proactive means obviously implementing a single sign-on solution, gathering the identities into one place, constantly scanning for the state identities because we see many of them with our customers. The second part of being predictive is, I think, the examples that I just gave, two of them kind of emphasize how important it is. So just being able to identify the potential risk with privileged identities helps you to prioritize your work, help you to prioritize your monitoring, and to take actions and reduce the blast radius in case bad things going to happen. Last thing, reactive, is more about right-sizing, restricting unused permissions, adaptive MFA, of course, thinking about implementing a software-defined perimeter. So these kind of actions can be very helpful in case things are going out of control. When we're talking about privileges, implementing principle of least privileges, it's something that is very important, again, in the cloud, because any excessive access can result with a devastating results because it's public. Second thing is segregation of duty. I think there's a lot of tools that address it in the on-premise world, but in the cloud, again, it's a different challenge. I'll give an example. We see many users using their own admin account with both to consume data from the organization and also to manage the service itself. That's a very risky usage, and we're recommending our customer to do a separation between your O365 SaaS admin to his actual account in the organization, because it's easier, by the way, that way to monitor the user, because if he's not doing any management actions, but he's also trying to access data, it's a good indication for either an account takeover or an insider threat. The second thing about being predictive, again, there's high privileges. Sometimes it's a built-in admin roles with AWS, as you saw. Sometimes it's the Apex on Salesforce, and others the permissions. So having a tight grip on these permissions and tracking who is part of this permissions is something that is crucial. And being reactive is more about implementing privilege access management, is about doing access certification for the privileges and cleaning permissions, something that we tend to forget. Third thing is about resources. So resources, we see that being proactive is about mapping your crown jewels of your organization, understanding what are the critical environments. Part of the platform, for part of the cases, for compliance, for example, they will also offer platform encryption, something you should consider, but I don't think it's always mandatory. When it comes to be predictive, so taking these assets that you really want to make sure that they're not going public or just broadly shared inside the organization, and just tracking them much more tightly. And obviously for being reactive, so data loss prevention tools. We see today many companies focused only on this domain, which we think it's great. And last thing that I want to talk about is posture and configuration. Then when we're talking about proactive, it's more about the periodic audit, it's about compliance, it's about comparing yourself against the CIS benchmark, which is very important, allegedly basic stuff, but very important stuff. When we're talking about being predictive, so again, just tracking the most crucial configurations, crucial workloads inside your organization. And about reactives, we see two types of solutions. So cloud detection and response could be something like workload protection for IaaS, but also access monitoring, which is basically one of the things that we really like to focus on with Polyrize. 5 practical steps that we think that starting from the basic stuff to the more advanced stuff. So obviously super is the first step for everything in security. So mapping your cloud, understanding who are those users, those super users in your cloud, your critical assets, because I think that it's much more complicated than just that it used to be in the on-premise world, right? Like admins, non-admins, there's a lot of gray areas there that, as you saw with the example, right? We had a Salesforce Apex user. It doesn't mean he's an admin. So identifying those users is something that is very important. Same for privileges and assets. Second part, which sounds pretty basic, but you'll be surprised to see how many identities we identify with the organization that doesn't have MFA. They don't have MFA. We see this because many times we tend to think that a single sign-on will solve this problem for us, which is correct, but you can identify a lot of other local IAM users that these users are kind of a blind spot for the organization. Many times they have a lot of bad practices, so it's something that you should take into consideration. Enforced list privileges, I think that we kind of covered this, how important it is that permissions is not a nice to have in the cloud. Another thing is about integrating your SIEM. So you need to do just kind of a refresh and go through your cloud and SaaS environment, making sure the data is flowing correctly to your SIEM. Many times there's a lot of important information that is accessible only through the API. So it's something that you should definitely take into consideration and maybe actively pull this data. Another thing is about external vendors. So I think I kind of covered it, but external vendors today, there's not a lot of good solution for them because, as I said, you're not managing their account, you're not able to offboard them. So they're just accessing your environment. In a certain point of time, either your employee that used to work with this subcontractor is leaving the company, either they are leaving their company and they don't offboard themselves correctly, and it's just expanding the attack surface of your organization in a way that basically you never revoke these permissions and it's just evolving. So it's something that should be highly prioritized, and it's about managing their access and identifying when it's a stale access or they have too wide access to your environment. Just to sum up what we just covered, so we think that the cloud is a great enabler, great business enabler. We think that as opposed to many other opinions, we think that it's the cloud is really improving the level of security today. But we also see that it's new. The shared responsibility new, as you saw in the previous slides, it's very different. It requires a different culture, different state of mind, different tools, and different focus, right? Just you don't need to cover all the stack with a shared responsibility model, but you need to have adequate tool to address the fact that it's very fragmented, and to address the fact that it's diverse and that is also public. So this is the last point, that in the cloud mistakes cost more because obviously permissions, it's something, for example, that we didn't like to give a lot of effort on it in the on-premise world, because we count on the fact that there are many other defense lines. But in the cloud, it's just permissions. It's mandatory to manage them correctly, because as you saw, if you don't, the impact could be very devastating. So at this point, I'll stop, and I'll be glad to hear if you have any questions in general or in specific on the slide just so.
William here. Okay, for the audience, there are two ways you can do the question. One is you can share it in the chat group. We'll take note of that and then we'll answer. Or if you prefer, you can also speak up. I take note of your question. There's a question in the chat group. Okay, I'll take note about the question. Maybe to facilitate that, I think it's the right time now to introduce our panelists. Actually, we have a panel discussion after Nati presentation. Of course, will be the panelists will include Nati and also Mr. Yam from CSA, not Cloud Security Alliance. It's a cybersecurity agency. Okay, so we have 3 panelists. Okay, I think the first question in the chat now is, is Yen. Yen will be representing Cloud Security Alliance Singapore chapter. Okay, there's one question in the chat group now. Many vendors are addressing the confidentiality and the availability vectors of the CIA threat. Okay, what is your approach to protect data integrity vector? Okay.
Yeah.
Any takeaway on that? Maybe our guest speaker, Nati.
Yeah,
I will pass the baton to you first.
No problem. Yeah, so I think, one of the things is that, as I mentioned, cloud providers today are offering data encryption in place that you can add. So I think that in that case, this is something that worth considering. And the second thing is monitoring access on files and keep it on the record. Again, as I mentioned, not necessarily through the SIEM, but also by doing an active queries to pull this data and have it in place in case you need to have it for forensics and attestations. And also, as I mentioned, there's a lot of DLP solutions today designed for the cloud. I think that 8 to 10 years ago, we saw the CASBs. They were the first generation of cloud security. They did the first layer. But today we see more in-depth solution for each one of these domains that the CASBs we're doing. So for example, with Polyrize, it's the identities and privileges. And we also see solutions that are very focused with DLP. So just to sum up my question, I think that platform encryption that is being offered through the cloud provider itself, and access monitoring is the second, and implementing DLP is the third thing.
Great, thank you, Nati. Okay,
sure.
I think the CIA is our cybersecurity practitioner. We abide by that. The CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability. Okay, that's good. Okay, I think there's another question in the chat. Let me just read it out. I was once a system admin during early stage of my career. Most of the topics discussed as same as what we used to do for on-premises systems, and maybe improve ways of doing the same. What is the real difference between on-premise, security, and cloud? Okay, maybe this one, Yen?
Yep. Fundamentally, on the theory, on the basis, they appear the same, because you still have to do, like you mentioned, the CIA, right? So the defense of the artifacts, sorry, are still there. The main difference is span of control and visibility. That is the big, very, very big difference. In your own DC, on your on-prem, you have full access to the network pipes. You can see the traffic. You can see every process running. You can go down to minute detail. The big difference in the cloud is you are now relying on a third party where you have limited access to areas like hardware. You have limited areas to access, like looking at the firmwares and the monitoring metrics of the hardware, and also at the detail level of the network. So we have to elevate a lot of the monitoring, a lot of the controls up the OSI level, right? We have to go further up the level. And that, to me, is the key difference. If you ask this question, I think that's the key difference. So fundamentally, we still have to do the work. The approach and tools will be the fundamental difference. I mean, anybody else want to chip in?
This is Yang. So the principles of security are not changed, like what Enlo has said. All right. And I think the issue here, as also clearly mentioned by Nati, all right, is that in the cloud, shared responsibility becomes the model, which doesn't appear in your premise on-prem security. On-prem security is all on your own resource and your own capability. All right. So once you have shared responsibility, this is where you need to have a very good arrangement with your cloud provider to make sure that each of you are able to do your work properly. And like Nati said, impact on the cloud, when it happens, it's going to be very big. All right, so these are fundamentally some of the main differences. Is the principles are the same, all right, but it's really how you do it and the responsibility are changed. All right, so ideally, if you don't have much resources and so forth, you try to move to either a SaaS model or security as a service model, so that as much of the work is done by the people who owns the infrastructure, who owns the security. And actually, CSA has done a proof of concept with Google in one of our projects, where our government needs to interact with the ASEAN governments. All right, we work with Google, and Google covered everything. All right, That means it's beyond even software as a service. They cover the security monitoring, they covered the provisioning and so forth. So they actually went around ASEAN to supply hardware token for multi-factor authentication. So in theory, it can be done, but it's a different kind of model that needs to be in place to when you go to the cloud.
Thank you, Yam. Thank you. I think to summarize the thing, I think that in principle, the security principle is there. The implementation, that makes a difference. Okay. Let me just throw in the Spana into the discussion. Okay. Since we're waiting for the rest to put in some questions.
Let's not solve for it for now.
Sorry, can you hear me? Okay. There's a lot of discussion about right to audit in the cloud environment. So I would like to hear from the panelists, what is your view about, let's say in the contract that you stated that if you use a cloud, you put in the contract the term that right to audit the cloud provider. I'd like to hear from the panelists, what is your view about that? Is it practiced in Asia here or maybe in the Middle East, in some other country? Maybe we start from Nati.
Sorry, William, I had a problem with my line. If you can repeat just the last sentence, sorry.
Okay, I just want to throw in a Spana into a discussion to make the thing more interesting. Typically, a lot of contract, I think they indicate that the right to audit the cloud provider. So I just want to hear from your view, is it practiced in your region, the right to audit? Because in Asia, it may have a different concept in terms of the right to audit. What is the meaning of that?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, it's a bit hard to hear you, but I think you mentioned the right to audit.
Audit, yes.
Yeah. So you're just to make sure I understand. Do you mean it from the perspective of the compliance or the to have this in terms of privacy? Just if you can narrow down the question.
In general sense, I think there's a lot of this consultant that actually they propose to put the clause in the contract, right to audit, so that when they negotiate with the cloud provider, the service provider, the clause is there so that they can take some action. So
yeah.
What is your...
Mm-hmm. So today I think that what we see is it's more about I think maybe it's related to the fact that in Israel we have kind of it's considered to be a small consumer with the cloud providers. So usually you will use the out of the box capabilities that they're allowing, but we don't have any special I would say privileges to get this data from them. So as I mentioned, you're kind of using the basic thing that they're providing through their own services, but there's nothing, there's no special rights in terms of the audits that we can get from the cloud providers.
Okay, thank you. Great. Okay, we have another question in the chat. Okay, let me just read it out. What do we foresee in the next 3 to 5 years or longer for the future of the cloud security with regards to the blockchain, quantum, or any upcoming technologies? This is first question. The second question is cloud security with regards to the industry 4.0 in terms of new standards, policies, business processes, etc. I will open to the panelists. Tatika?
I don't see them as any conflict. Technology will move, things will move. I guess it's blockchain today. It's just a series of you're training different computers, you different calculation. Quantum, it affects some of the algorithm. We need quantum proof algorithm for encryption and stuff like that. But other than that, I don't think it's changed. The fundamental technology might change. So for example, IBM's Q runs on very specific quantum hardware. The fundamental technology of the hardware is different, but the way you use it per utilization, charge per utilization, the compute model is the same for end user in terms of that. But how you use it, where you use it, I think it'd be more in purpose built, right? For example, today I need high performance. I use a lot of FPGA instance. So only few vendors can provide me an FPGA instance to do my work. So I have to go FPGA but the model, they charge me for utilization, they charge me per CPU cycle, but it's not x86. So I think the way the cloud operates fundamentally is not changing, but you might have specific hardware change that will change some of the processes below. For example, the way you do cloud forensics might be changed because of the underlying hardware. But in terms of compute model, I don't think so. I mean, you still have to do IAM, you still have to do user access, you still have to audit, you still have to check all your access rights and stuff like that. So, and you have to check where your data is stored. So same but different, right?
Yeah, great point. Great point. Any add-on from the other panelists?
Not from me. I agree. Basically, at least from the 3 to 5 years, in fact, quantum may not even come into the picture yet.
What about in terms of the second question that you mentioned about cloud security with regards to the Industry 4.0 standards, new standards policy, or even business processes? Anything that the panelists can share from that perspective?
No, I think it ties into my answer. It's business processes, functions will change, policies will change. We have to react. Regulatory updates, we have to change. We have to react. That's no different from cloud, not cloud, right? I mean, if they're going to audit certain things, we have to get ready for it. If the encryption standard is specified in a regulatory statement, we have to do it. So I think it's a cloud agnostic question in the sense that business and technologists like us, we have to be able to react to a new. So post-COVID is an interesting one. Because a lot of things have changed, and we are now everybody's struggling to say what is the new world, and we adapt accordingly to the new processes, new models, new standards. So I think it's not a cloud specific question. I think it's something that we just have to deal with as businesses.
Okay, great. We have another question in the chat. Okay, the SAN, Digital Forensic and Incident Response. In short, is it called DFIR? Share a presentation about log tampering in 2017 for privilege access escalation. SIEM vendor like Splunk reported something similar in 2015 as their platform did not detect log tampering. Nati indicated that it is advised to check your SIEM logs. But if the logs are compromised now, can we ensure that these logs are not tampered with because it gives a false sense of security? Nati?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there are two basic things here that are important to notice. The first one, it's really important from once in a while to monitor check for your environment. I can say that, for example, here with Polyrize, with the crucial infrastructure, we're having some automation that need to create a trigger. So this is how we know that the entire workflow is working appropriately. Second thing, which is always a good practice also for the on-prem, is to make the SIEM out of band and not part of the network of the organization. This is a real pain point in the cloud. And by the way, this is one of the things that we addressed first with Polyrize, is that, to do the queries with the API and to monitor the logs, this is something that is very important. Sometimes the provider will change the interface as well. And you're right. I mean, one of the things that we saw more sophisticated attacks, by the way, is, for example, with AWS. So the obvious would be, if you're an attacker, would be to delete the cloud trail, or to redirect it. But more sophisticated attacks will be also about changing the bucket to a read-only mode, for example. The answer here is that, you see, this is one of the things that we don't have sufficient tools yet. As I mentioned, Solutions like Polyrize and others they start to address it, but it's something pretty new. So my best recommendation here is, to do a periodic check on it. Maybe create something that will create a trigger every once in a while to give a good indication that it's still working. And for the most crucial infrastructure or SaaS, just creating like an ad hoc script, to make sure it's still on and to make it out of band.
Thanks for the explanation. Great
This is
explanation.
Yam from. So, if you are on premise and where you have control, all right. So one way of doing to ensure that your logs are not tampered with is that you have to create a centralized logging system. That means whatever your servers are logging, all right, immediately a copy is sent to the centralized log system. So in this way, the attacker can only modify what he has access, which is on the server, but he cannot have access to the centralized server. So in that sense, there's one way of ensuring your logs are not tampered with. Then secondly, is like what Nati has said, you need to have a monitoring mechanism. All right, if the logs are not to be touched by a human being, for example, all right, you can monitor for behaviors and access. Anyone that is doing that, you can then, figure out that they may need to do some checking or investigation. The issue is the logs that are in the cloud. This is where the problem today, and that one I don't have an answer, but I think if Polyrize has an answer, I guess we can look at that later.
So just follow up to Yam says, on-prem, the typical method is a syslog with a worm format, right? Write once, read many format, which is typically how you would set up logging in the cloud. How I do it is I actually have a logging VPC. So I don't write even to the same S3 in the same VPC. This is just replicating our on-prem design to the cloud, totally separate. So this is especially crucial. It's less crucial if you're talking about EC2 logs because there are system logs. You can do comparison from the OS level and compare. But today I'm dealing a lot with serverless. When you do about serverless application, it's all just the only thing you have is the log, nothing else. There's no agent, and then they live for 5 minutes, they disappear, right? So the logging becomes really important. So advice is when you design your serverless application, also design the logging infrastructure to make sure it's secure. So the good practice is to keep your logs in a separate VPC, for example, or if you're really good, you want to do a hybrid, put it on-prem or put it in another cloud, So there are many ways to do it, but the key thing is separation of duties, really separated logs, and to set the writings to, if possible, to a worm. Write once, read many. So that's probably how I would advise people to do it.
Thank you, Yan. Thank you for the recommendation. Thank you so much. Okay, I think there's another question. It's not in the chat. Maybe I just read it out. Okay, it's very close to what we're happening now around the world. Work from home will be the new normal. How should enterprise organizations adjust their cyber or cloud security strategy and plans to cope with the COVID-19 situation? I would like to open to to continue with Yan.
I can take this very quickly. Should do the timing, but I can tell you what has changed a lot is the endpoint and the network has changed. So your parameter monitoring is gone. Your office network monitoring is gone. People are working from home, their own computers, their own network, right? So things move to the cloud. This is where the rise of SASE. So if you guys are familiar with SASE, which is Secure Access Service Edge, is another one of the wonderful Gartner terms that Gartner invented back in 2019. It's about a combination of what we used to know as firewall as a service, CASB, identity management, all in one. But it becomes really important to be able to audit where and when and what they access. So I see a big shift towards SASE type solution. Not naming any vendor here, but there's quite a few in the market. But you can actually look into them. Most of them address it in a way, but trying to do the same thing. So it's one of the biggest changes where we start looking at controls. It's not a corporate network, it's a public ISP. So the concerns we had about cloud security now goes into ISP security, home security, and stuff like that. So that's what I see that one of the biggest shift and changes are.
Thank you. That's great. Mr. Yang, do you want to add on something on this?
Yeah, basically, like Ian said, your perimeter is gone, so you cannot rely on that kind of security, right? But the endpoint is still used. That means the person still need to use his computer at home, the laptop. So one way is to make sure you shift your security to the endpoint itself, all right? But in this case, you need to find a good MSSP that can provide the security of your endpoint in the cloud. Because basically what people need to do now is really go on the cloud. The other one is you will find that more and more people need to use a video conferencing kind of mechanism. And if you chose the wrong system, then whatever you are discussing, whatever sensitive information that you are showing, all right, will be leaked out. So you have to make sure that you choose appropriate a video conferencing system that primarily has to have two things. The first one is an ability to control who can join your meetings. That is important because then you know who are the people that is officially in the meeting. So that example, like what we did in Zoom here, you have a meeting room. People need to go through this meeting room in order to be admitted. That's one. Secondly, from the technology perspective, you need to have end-to-end encryption. Unfortunately, sad to say, based on all the video conferencing system that we have examined, all right, especially those that are multi-party, no one has full end-to-end. Of course, we will try to see whether Zoom, when it comes out in July, whether the end-to-end is really full end-to-end, right? Otherwise, most of the stuff would be ended up in the video conferencing server, somewhere in between. And if you have recording, all right, and again, these recordings, you don't have control. People can, leak the recordings of whatever classified or sensitive discussion that you have. So that's the other concern when people start working from home. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Yang. Thank you. Okay, there's another question. Good. It's coming in, a lot of questions coming in. Okay, let me read out the question. Centralized log hash keeping is not as strong as a decentralized method. AWS has a QRDB, but again, it's a centralized setup. Would creating a chain of custody and store the log hashes in a decentralized DLT architecture, would that be a better way to register and verify its log tampering? Sorry, the screen is a bit blurry, so I hope the question is correct.
DLT sounds wonderful, but we always hit with performance issues depending on how fast your stream. If you have a high transaction system, this will not work. You're going to have a lot of issues with performance, or you might have out of sync from your logging to your application. So there's no cure-all technology. We've got to see what you want to do. But in most cases, a file integrity manager would do it just as well. Something like a Guardian FIM and stuff like that would actually solve some of these problems. So one of the things we as practitioners need to do, very pragmatic, is to not over-engineer also. So I guess one of the things we need to see is it depends really. I know everybody hates that answer, but it really depends on the type of system and the velocity of logs being generated.
And I think that, if I may add, so I think also simplicity is something that is very important to remember, right? Doing the very ambitious projects means that you need also to maintain them over time. I think first problem today for organization, for security teams, it's human resources and having good people over time and maintaining the knowledge. So keeping it simple, good practices, taking into consideration that AWS had many sub-services, and tomorrow you're going to have multi-cloud strategy, and you probably want to use also the SaaS. It's better to have it simple and to have it very concise than just trying to be very excellent in just one vertical. But this is at least my point of view.
Great. Okay. There's another question which is not in the chat. Maybe I just share it out. Cloud computing access usually via some sort of API connection. Would the traditional practices such as least privilege, segregation by duties still valid and applicable? Or is there a better way for the access control in the cloud? Okay, maybe I will let Mr. Yang.
Yeah, so like we, sorry about the background noise. So like we said earlier, the security principles are applicable, all right? And also this was also brought up in Nati's presentation, you know, that it's important to have the principle, to apply principle of least privileges, you know, segregation and so forth. The other thing about API is also about making sure that your API are well designed and making sure that they can only be called. That means they need to have mutual authentication with other APIs. So this is another way of dealing with this issue, that so that you don't have a rogue malware or a rogue API that can then start calling your API to do its work. So these are some of the things that people can try to, but it really depends on the environment, depends on the setting you do, whether it's a cloud environment, whether it's a hybrid environment. So each of these will have a different way of doing things. But the principle of making sure that your API talks to only authorized application, that is one of the key requirements. All right. So how to do the authorization is like authentication, least privileges, you know, segregation of duties, things like that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Yang. Thank you. Yan, anything you want to add on? Nothing, anything you want to add on?
So just one word, because I think it's a great point what you mentioned, is that we tend to forget about the non-human identity in our cloud, which are very important. And I think that the bright side there is that it's easier to narrow down their access. So if we'll take the Capital One case, so if you're able to tell what type of actions your roles are repetitively doing, and it's a non-human role, so it's much more predictive. So least privilege could be more strictly enforced. So I think that if you can even take greater steps when it comes to the non-human identities and to protect them on a better way. So this is just like one comment.
Absolutely. I mean, I was going to mention that Nati says, because non-humans are very predictable, you can baseline it very, very well, and anomaly detection is so much easier. Humans, they can decide to do ABC or CDE, you know, the next day the sequence is out, but programmatic access is usually much more static, and then the patterns are floating up more easily. So with any anomaly detection software, it's actually much easier. And then from then you can do regular reviews to tighten and make the privilege smaller and smaller as you go to improve. So totally agree with that.
Great. Okay, it's almost 1 o'clock. Actually, it's 1 o'clock now. I don't want to hold back to our panelists at lunchtime and also Nati's early morning in your country. So I think if there's okay, I will only receive one more last question. Is there anyone from the ground or any from the audience that you have any last question that you want to ask before we close the session? Any question that you want to ask so that you can take your lunch peacefully later? That's a joke. Okay. Okay. If not, then let me just share the reminder. A reminder from Cloud Security Alliance Singapore chapter. We are open for membership, student member, corporate member, professional member, and also in terms of events, all these things, you can always go and visit the website, Cloud Security Alliance Singapore chapter website, to know what are the coming events, and also we need your support and help to register and also support the events for those that we have planned. And with that, I think I will want to thank the panelists, Mr. Yang, Yan, and of course our speaker, Mr. Nati, all the way early morning, calling in to present. And more importantly is the audience. the participation. Thank you so much for taking your time, especially in Singapore here. We are lunchtime, for sacrificing your lunch to attend this session. Without your support, I think the session would not be possible. Thank you so much, and thank you the panelists, and thank you CSA Singapore chapter for organizing this session to share with the public. With that, thank you so much, and we'll close the session.